How many rock bands can you name who've been sent on a collision course with destiny by a hamster bite? The answer to that is the same as the answer to this. How many records in rock and roll history can truly be called heroic? Many bands crave hero worship, but the Sex Pistols, fragile, unprepared kids, created the freedoms we have to thank for the existence of this. We've
outgrown our usefulness, like nipples on men.
I'm as important as a nipple on a woman.
And this.
For the record, is there any way you could have had sex with that young woman or any young woman trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein?
With their single God Save the Queen, they went head to head with a nation's delusions, and for their trouble were placed in serious physical danger, the targets of a national hate campaign. And this all happened thanks to a series of accidents, which I will now describe, including the pivotal role played by a hamster. Accident number 1, Recruitment. The Strand were a crap band in London playing Small Faces and Rod Stewart songs. It was Wally Nightingale on guitar, Paul Cook on drums and Steve Jones on vocals, but only Nightingale could really play. The one thing going for them was a connection to Malcolm McLaren, an odd, waspish guy with a few music business connections and a store selling fetish wear. McLaren had seen the birth of American punk and felt Britain needed the same, back to basics rock. And he thought Jones had the right roguish vibe but could see that he was no good out front. So he encouraged him to learn guitar instead, sent them Glen Matlock to play bass and had them ditch Nightingale. Now needing a frontman, his partner Vivienne Westwood suggested they try that Weird John guy who came in the shop sometimes. Weird John looked good, so they tried him out, but he hated their music, was obnoxious and couldn't sing. Regardless, they gave him a chance. There was a certain magnetism about him, and quickly, this tone-deaf pain in everyone's arse proved himself the missing piece. His contempt for their rock cliches gave them an edge.
Hey, that's fucking awful. Stop it. Stop it. It's fucking awful. Ah!
And he could do what they couldn't.
John obviously had his lyrical edge, which took the songs to a different level altogether.
Unfortunately, he was also utterly uncontrollable and spelt the end of any dreams McLaren had of a group he could mould. It was only after this was all in motion that Westwood told McLaren he'd got the wrong John. The one they had, John Lydon of Finsbury Park, soon nicknamed Rotten for his bad teeth, actually roamed London as part of a pack of 4 Johns, and she'd meant them to try this other guy, John Beverley, of whom more later. But this was how the Pistols got the front man who would stir all this trouble, completely by accident. Accident number 2, swearing. The next few months were about gigs, adding new songs, finding their feet. Some found them exciting for being so different and abrasive. Whereas others found them repellent for the same reasons. Hostility followed them from the start. They were signed by EMI in October 1976. A debut single came out and a December tour was booked. But during rehearsals, a limo driver rushed in saying he had orders to drive them across town so they could appear on a cosy chat show hosted by Bill Grundy. Where, famously, this happened.
Shit.
And all hell was let loose on Merry England. The populace, their delicate sensibilities heretofore unroughened by such innately horrifying word noises, were outraged, but the band weren't even meant to be on the show. Queen, another EMI group, were, but they pulled out at the last moment. Nor did the Pistols go there intending to stir trouble, being at least partly provoked by Grundy.
Go on, you've got another 5 seconds. Say something outrageous.
You dirty bastard.
Go on, again.
You dirty
The band were confused, saying, "We thought they bleeped stuff on TV." But now they were under the glare of a hostile attention that ensured the whole country would be aware of whatever they did next. And this was just accident number 2 on the route to some absolute scenes. Accident number 3, laundry. In the early days of the Pistols, Lydon had a jacket. He always liked to dress oddly. During the days of strikes when trash piled high in the streets, he wore a garbage bag. Later, when his parents bought him a lovely suit, he came back out an hour later, having cut it to ribbons and reassembled it with safety pins. But this particular item, a white lady's rowing jacket, gave him an idea. One day he mistakenly dyed it pink in the wash, and so he vandalised it further, writing "God Save Our Gracious Queen" all over it, which made him think, that's an interesting idea for a song. For a long time, Lydon had resented having to pay tax to support that silly cow who couldn't give a shit about me. And now this accident with the jacket acted as a spark. Mid-70s Britain was a mess. Strikes, inflation, power cuts, the trash piles. He thought it was about time someone said something. And one morning before rehearsal, wrote out some words while waiting for his baked beans to cook. For a while that was that. Various tunes came and went, but the words didn't fit any of them. Until, during the recording of Anarchy in the UK, Glen Matlock started driving everyone mad playing something on the piano, a tune partly lifted from the Move's Fire Brigade. The first the world knew of it was 2 months later on December the 6th in Leeds. By this point, the nationwide scandal around them was 5 days old, and this Leeds Polytechnic show, the first of the tour where they weren't hounded out of town before they'd even played a note, was the moment they decided to debut a song utterly slating the nation's pride. The one that, when it came out, would make the people who already hated them actively want to kill them. 5 days later, they cut a demo.
God save the Queen, the fascist regime.
It's lyrically 90% there, with just a few placeholder lines like "God Save Winderline." The structure has some serious flab in it, with this long boring middle section where Lydon shouts "God Save the Queen" over a key change.
God save the Queen, God save the Queen.
Followed by an extra chorus, a crap solo, and a third verse that was just a repeat of the second. The sound was thin, the playing half-arsed, and the riffs nothing special. But it was a start, and for the time being, they had bigger things to worry about. 2 days after introducing swearing to a shocked nation, the band's tour began. Of 24 planned gigs, only 7 would go ahead, often in the face of protests.
We hope tonight by this protest to make Wales know, to let the people of this town know that we do protest.
The worst of the punk rock groups, I suppose, currently are the Sex Pistols. They are unbelievably nauseating. They are the antithesis of humankind.
The staff at EMI Records were delighted. A&R Mike Thorne said this august institution hadn't had so much fun in years. Sadly, the label were only a division of the larger EMI corporation, whose head, John Reed, saw them as a minor concern next to EMI's main business, defence contracts and brain scanners. The Sex Pistols were a huge embarrassment, and there was an urgent need to save face with the corporation's old-school business network. So Reed was understandably double miffed to find himself on December the 7th having to call the head of the record division to ask if it was true that the band had said "F*** the Queen" during their show in Leeds. Thinking fast, they replied Lydon had actually said "fuck Queen," and Reed said, "Oh, that's not so bad then." But it wasn't enough. In January 1977, the day after Glen Matlock played his final gig with the band, they were dropped from the label, walking away with a £50,000 advance payment. Matlock was around for one last demo session.
God save the Queen.
No Future was now much better. The solo had been folded into the key change section. The 3 verses and choruses were reduced to 2, and this, coupled with a faster tempo, cut around 1:40 from the runtime. Overall, it still has a demo's hesitancy, and Glen's bass line has some ill-judged, show-busy, vibe-killing razzmatazz in it.
God save.
But overall, this once watery tea was now much stronger and almost ready to be spilt. For as long as anyone can remember, Charles has been the King of England, a comforting, constant presence, sharing our joys, shouldering our fears, carrying his office with a quiet dignity and a humble allegiance to quack medicine. But snuggled here in the sure knowledge that Charles can never die, it's good to remember there was a time before Charles, that of his mother, Queen Elizabeth. Born in 1952 and, at the time, the very avatar of Britain's greatness, the people would have no more disparaged or questioned her than they would have insulted the sun or interrogated the moon. And, although we now know her intent all along was to one day betray us all by dying, in 70s Britain the people were blissfully unaware, their adoration total. Accident 4. Bitten by Hamster. With Glen gone, the other John's moment had arrived. Him and Lydon had become friends at college. John Beverley, a witty, silly and sweet kid, but also impressionable and lost. Lydon at the time had a weedy pet hamster he'd sarcastically named Sid Vicious, and one day Beverley was trying to be sweet to it. It bit him, and the name was transferred to him, the joke being the same because he was a big softy too. But as punk grew, Beverley was noticed in the audience at gigs and became notorious as Sid Vicious. His nickname and look seemed custom-made for this aggressive new movement, and it became an identity for him to hide inside. Later, when the Pistols needed a bassist, he fit perfectly image-wise. He couldn't play, but none of them could at first. He'd figure it out, right? The Pistols was a whirlwind. He was suddenly all over the news, and a name that had been armour became pressure, an image he felt obliged to live up to.
I wanted him to bring himself, but he ended up imitating himself. Sidney started to believe himself as a toughie.
He was really quite a shy person, and all the bravado and that was just a front. He was very gentle and a really nice person.
Meanwhile, McLaren had found them a new label, A&M. No Future was the clear choice for a single, now retitled God Save the Queen at his insistence. But on the same day the record went to pressing plants, Beverley, acting out his new persona, was part of a gang who attacked Whispering Bob Harris in a bar. Harris was the presenter of one of TV's leading music shows and seen as representing the hippie old guard that punk was now standing against. Beverley jabbed a broken bottle in the face of Harris's colleague, who needed 14 stitches. An indefensible act made worse by the fact that Harris was someone record labels needed on side, his show being vital promotion for bands. Within days, the Pistols were dropped from their second record contract in months, this time walking away with a £75,000 advance. And this was why, rather than being released in March, God Save the Queen was delayed, eventually coming out on Virgin Records on May 27th, 11 days before the Queen's Silver Jubilee weekend. The single may have been inflammatory, but the Jubilee hadn't been on the band's radar.
I don't think we was actually really aware. We didn't sit down and say, let's write an anti-Jubilee song.
But now, a chain of causality put this anti-monarchy song from the UK's Public Enemy's #1 on a collision course with the UK's biggest moment of patriotic fever in years. The record would be all over the news the week of the celebrations, maximising its impact as both social commentary and as the slap in the face the royalist public took it as.
We declared war on England without meaning to.
This timing was pure accident, and it was all started by the hamster bite that turned him into this. As a production, God Save the Queen got what it needed. The band played those spindly riffs like they meant them, Steve Jones covering the bass for Sid. The lyrics took their final form with the added line, "When there's no future, how can there be sin?" And Lydon, hesitant on the demos, held nothing back this time. The result was a classic, largely not of melody or composition, but of courage, feeling and righteousness. The No Future refrain working as a direct, despairing rebuttal of all the pomp that was otherwise filling the airwaves and the newsstands. But all that said, wouldn't it have been better slowed down and done without lyrics, by an orchestra? No, wait, that actually happened, and it was crap. By Jubilee weekend, the single had sold 150,000 copies, despite many stations refusing to play it and many shops refusing to sell it. The single got to number 2 regardless, not that anyone would admit it. After its release, Lydon said it was physically impossible for me to walk the streets on my own. On June 19th, he was out with the band's engineer and producer, and they were chased by a gang wielding knives and shouting, "We love our Queen, you bastards."
There were like 11 guys there, and they had like bottles, knives, the lot. It was a football team.
I really don't think what he was singing about was outrageous. He's not saying let's kill her. He was pretty much pointing out what the truth was.
Lydon was stabbed in the leg and hand, only being saved from much worse injury by thick leather trousers. The next day, drummer Paul Cook was beaten with an iron bar. Photographer Bob Gruen describes being at a bar with Lydon and Jones, a music industry hangout where they'd hoped for some respite, when suddenly every glass in the place came raining down on them. What was the root of such hostility? It's interesting how the worst of it, the actual violence, came from the working classes, the people worst affected by the inequality the band was singing about. Far more people respond to a hierarchy by seeking to climb it than by questioning its validity. And such people will put up with a lot as long as they got somebody to feel superior to. This is where jingoism comes in, something the working classes hardly have a monopoly on, but anyone craving a sense of superiority from society's bottom rung can only get it by imagining rungs that exist beneath them, which they mentally populate with foreigners, saying, "At least we're better than the bloody frogs or the bloody krauts." In the UK, this kind of arrogance has been fuelled since 1945 by the existence of the royal family and little else. Even now, a majority of Britons would rather be spat on by someone waving a Union Jack than have to live near a black family. But anyone pointing out what a sham all this is will not be thanked for it. Impoverished royalists didn't want to hear there was no future in England's dreaming, because they had nothing else. And that may have been partly thanks to the contempt with which they're treated by the top tiers of society, royals included, but it's just easier to ignore all that and keep dreaming and kick the shit out of anyone who dares to criticise.
When the attacks come so physically, you know that you're getting at it. When people get that angry, you know that they somehow deep down inside know they're wrong.
In the face of all this violence, the band got no help, McLaren being concerned only with reactive pot stirring. No security was laid on and no support offered. In fact, when Lydon appeared on radio to discuss his favourite records, McLaren was furious with him. Johnny Rotten was meant to be this terrifying whirlwind of nihilism, not a thoughtful chap who likes Irish folk music. He'd ruined the image. The fact that that image was in danger of getting Lydon killed seemed not to bother him. Even after the band finished, Lydon was subject to constant raids and police harassment, and eventually driven out of the country. He relocated to America, becoming a citizen in 2015. The Sex Pistols lasted another 7 months, fizzling out in January 1978. John Beverley, now hopelessly addicted to heroin, was dead a year later. The Sex Pistols didn't go through it all for nothing. They were a bell that could not be unrung. Prior to this record, the royal family were treated with religious reverence. The idea of mocking, criticising, or even investigating them, unknown to mainstream culture. No other band can claim to have been the catalyst for such a shift in attitudes. When the song again shot up the charts for the Golden Jubilee, it went to number 1, and this time the fact was widely acknowledged. Lydon had this to say.
I'm actually really proud of the Queen for surviving and doing so well. I applaud her for that. That's a fantastic achievement. I just think that if I'm paying my tax money to support this system, I should have a say-so on how it's spent.
Which many saw as a gross betrayal, asking how this once scathing firebrand could be seen dead talking to Piers Morgan. But while heroes may change, moulder, and in select cases die, the band's legacy stands. And while this huge impact may have occurred by accident, the members of the Sex Pistols, regardless, paid a heavy and heroic price for it. So, what's everyone's opinions? Is there a more heroic record than this one? If you can think of any, be sure to let us know in the comments. Meanwhile, if you've enjoyed this, please feel free to click the PayPal link below and send me £125,000 in tribute to the amount the Pistols were paid by their first 2 record labels to go away. I took the liberty of adjusting this amount for inflation, so if any of you would rather, in a spirit of strict historical accuracy mind, send me £993,648.02, you've got that option also. To hear me discuss the Sex Pistols some more, here's me doing my best under trying circumstances to rank all their songs. And there's a subscribe button. And remember,